On a warm March evening in 2022, 37-year-old Cassie Lynn Carli kissed her daughter goodbye and drove to a parking lot in Pensacola, Florida. It was supposed to be a simple custody exchange with her ex-boyfriend, Matthew White. Routine, predictable, safe. But Cassie never came home. By nightfall, her phone went silent. Her family's texts went unanswered. Panic set in. Within hours, volunteers flooded the streets with flyers. Police dogs combed through empty lots. Everyone prayed for a miracle. 2 days later, investigators found her body in a shallow grave 30 miles away. The community was shattered. Matthew White, the father of her child, became the prime suspect. Digital evidence, surveillance footage, and a chilling confession would soon reveal the truth. But how does a mother vanish in broad daylight during a custody exchange? What really happened in that parking lot? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning of March 27, 2022, began like any other in Pensacola. Cassie Lynn Carli woke early, her mind already running through the day's tasks. She brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, sunlight filtering through the curtains. Her daughter still slept in the next room, bundled beneath blankets decorated with cartoon characters. Cassie listened to the soft rhythm of her child's breathing and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. She was a single mother, navigating a world that often felt tilted against her, but she had never wavered, not once. Cassie had always been dependable. Friends described her as the person who showed up when others forgot. Family knew her as the one who remembered birthdays, made extra casseroles for neighbors, and never missed a school event. She worked hard, saved carefully, and built a life that revolved around her daughter's happiness. The little girl was her world, her reason for waking up each morning with purpose. Every decision Cassie made passed through a single filter: what was best for her child. Her relationship with Matthew White had ended long ago, but the threads of their shared history remained tangled. They had a daughter together, which meant their lives intersected whether they wanted them to or not. Custody arrangements required coordination, schedules, and communication. Cassie approached these exchanges with caution. Matthew had always been unpredictable, his moods shifting like coastal weather, one moment calm, the next moment storming. She had learned to navigate his volatility with careful words and firm boundaries. That morning, Cassie dressed her daughter in comfortable clothes and packed a small bag. The custody exchange was scheduled for late afternoon at a public parking lot they both knew well. Neutral ground, witnesses nearby. Cassie preferred it that way. She had learned to protect herself through proximity to others, through the safety of open spaces and surveillance cameras. She kissed her daughter's forehead, buckled her into the car seat, and began the drive across town. Pensacola spread out around them, a city of modest homes and coastal breezes. The streets were familiar, the route memorized. Cassie's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel as she navigated through intersections and stop signs. Her daughter hummed a song from the back seat, oblivious to the tension her mother carried. Cassie glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled. Whatever happened between her and Matthew, their daughter deserved peace. She deserved stability. Cassie was determined to provide both. The parking lot came into view just after 4 in the afternoon. It was a quiet space beside a shopping center, half empty on a Sunday. A few cars dotted the asphalt. Cassie pulled into a spot near the entrance, close to the main road where foot traffic occasionally passed. She checked her phone. Matthew had texted confirming he was on his way. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. These exchanges always left her feeling hollow, as though she were handing over a piece of herself each time her daughter climbed into Matthew's vehicle. Minutes passed. Cassie waited, her eyes scanning the parking lot. A woman walked past with grocery bags. A man loaded boxes into his trunk. Everything felt ordinary. Then Matthew's car appeared, pulling into a spot several spaces away. Cassie's pulse quickened. She unbuckled her daughter and helped her out of the car, holding the small hand tightly. Together they walked across the asphalt toward Matthew's vehicle. Surveillance cameras mounted on nearby light poles captured the scene in grainy detail. The footage would later become critical evidence, a silent witness to the final moments of Cassie's life. But in that instant, she was simply a mother fulfilling an obligation, her face calm despite the unease coiling in her chest. She spoke briefly with Matthew, their words lost to the distance and the hum of traffic. The exchange was quick. Her daughter climbed into Matthew's car, waved through the window, and Cassie waved back. Then Matthew drove away. Cassie stood alone in the parking lot, watching the car disappear around a corner. She turned back toward her own vehicle, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The hardest part was over. She could go home now, reclaim a few hours of peace before the worry of separation set in again. She reached her car, opened the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine started. She adjusted the rearview mirror, and then, nothing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. Other shoppers came and went, unaware that something terrible was unfolding in their midst. Cassie's car sat in the parking lot, doors closed, engine running, time ticked forward, the sun dipped lower in the sky, and still, the car remained. By evening, Cassie's absence became impossible to ignore. Her family expected her home by 6. When 7 o'clock passed without a call or text, her mother began dialing her number. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. Her mother left a message, her voice light but edged with concern. She called again, still no answer. By 8 o'clock, worry had transformed into alarm. Cassie never went silent. She always responded, always checked in, always let people know where she was. Her mother called Cassie's friends, asking if anyone had heard from her. The responses were all the same. Nothing. No one had seen or spoken to Cassie since earlier that afternoon. Her mother's hands trembled as she dialed the non-emergency police line. She explained the situation, her voice breaking. Her daughter was missing. She had gone to meet her ex-boyfriend for a custody exchange and never returned. The officer on the line took down the details and promised to send someone to investigate. By nightfall, the Pensacola Police Department had opened a missing person case. Officers drove to the parking lot where Cassie was last seen, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found her car still parked in the same spot, doors locked, interior undisturbed. It sat there like a ghost, waiting for someone who would never return. The officers radioed for backup and began canvassing the area. They knocked on doors, questioned business owners, and checked surveillance footage from nearby cameras. The grainy video confirmed what Cassie's family had described. She had arrived, completed the exchange, and returned to her car. But what happened next remained a mystery. The first night of searching stretched long and tense. Volunteers gathered at the parking lot, organizing into groups to comb through nearby streets and wooded areas. They carried flashlights and called Cassie's name into the darkness, their voices swallowed by the night. Local media picked up the story, broadcasting her photograph across television screens and social media feeds. Cassie's face stared out from missing person posters, her smile frozen in time. The community responded with an outpouring of concern, sharing posts and offering prayers. But as the hours passed, hope began to thin. Cassie's mother sat in her living room, surrounded by family members who had rushed to her side. They spoke in hushed tones, offering comfort that felt hollow. Everyone knew the statistics. The longer someone remained missing, the less likely they would be found alive. But no one dared speak those words aloud. Instead, they clung to hope, to the possibility that Cassie had simply lost her phone, or gotten confused, or needed time alone. Deep down, though, they all felt the cold dread settling into their bones. By dawn on March 28, the search had expanded. Officers brought in cadaver dogs and conducted grid searches through wooded areas surrounding the parking lot. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thumping against the morning sky. Cassie's family gathered at her mother's house, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They hugged each other tightly, clinging to the fragile belief that Cassie would be found safe. But the silence from authorities was deafening. No leads, no sightings, no answers. Throughout the morning, search teams moved methodically through Pensacola. They checked drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, and empty lots. They interviewed residents and business owners, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on the evening of March 27. Most people shook their heads, their expressions sympathetic but unhelpful. The city had been quiet that night. Nothing had seemed out of place. And yet, somewhere in that ordinariness, Cassie Lynn Carli had vanished. Detectives turned their attention to Matthew White. He had been the last person to see Cassie, the last person to interact with her before she vanished. They brought him in for questioning, asking him to recount the events of the previous day. Matthew sat across from the detectives in a small interrogation room, his posture defensive. He claimed the exchange had gone smoothly. He said Cassie seemed fine. He insisted he had no idea what happened to her after he left. But his story felt rehearsed, his answers too careful. The detectives exchanged glances. Something was off. Surveillance footage corroborated parts of Matthew's account. The cameras showed him arriving at the parking lot, completing the exchange, and driving away. But they also showed something else. Matthew's car had returned to the area later that evening, lingering near the parking lot, long after Cassie's car had been abandoned. The detectives pressed him on this detail. Matthew stumbled, his explanation inconsistent. He claimed he had forgotten something and come back. When asked what he had forgotten, he couldn't provide a clear answer. The detectives made a note. Matthew White was now their prime suspect. The interrogation stretched on for hours. Matthew grew increasingly agitated, his calm facade cracking under sustained pressure. He insisted he had nothing to do with Cassie's disappearance, that he was being unfairly targeted because of their contentious relationship. The detectives remained impassive, presenting fact after fact, question after question. They asked about his movements, his phone records, his relationship with Cassie. Matthew deflected, denied, and defended. But with each passing minute, the weight of suspicion grew heavier. Meanwhile, the search for Cassie intensified. Teams fanned out across Escambia County, checking abandoned buildings, empty lots, and rural roads. Cassie's mother appeared on local news, her voice trembling as she begged for information. She described her daughter as a loving mother, a responsible woman who would never disappear without a word. She pleaded for anyone with knowledge to come forward. The community watched, their hearts breaking for a family in agony. But still, no sign of Cassie. Social media exploded with theories and speculation. Some people suggested Cassie had run away to escape a difficult situation. Others suspected foul play from the beginning. Friends posted memories and photographs, creating a digital memorial that grew by the hour. Cassie's face was everywhere on news websites, Facebook feeds, Twitter timelines. Thousands of people who had never met her felt personally invested in finding her. The case had captured the public imagination, tapping into deep fears about safety, trust, and the vulnerability of mothers navigating custody battles. On the afternoon of March 28, detectives received Cassie's phone records from her service provider. They combed through the data, looking for any clue about her final hours. The records showed normal activity throughout the day, texts to family, a call to a friend, GPS data tracking her route to the parking lot. Then, abruptly, all activity ceased. Her phone had either been turned off or destroyed shortly after the custody exchange. The detectives noted the timing. It aligned perfectly with Matthew White's presence at the parking lot. They also obtained Matthew's phone records. The data painted a troubling picture. His phone had been active throughout the evening of March 27, pinging off cell towers in a pattern that suggested movement. The towers traced a route from Pensacola toward Milton, a small town about 30 miles to the northeast. The phone had remained in that area for approximately 2 hours before returning to Pensacola. The detectives cross-referenced the timing with surveillance footage and witness statements. Everything pointed to Matthew White as the last person to see Cassie alive, and possibly the person responsible for her disappearance. As daylight faded on March 28, the search teams prepared for another night of looking. Volunteers gathered at the police station, receiving assignments and areas to cover. Cassie's family joined them, unable to sit idle while their loved one remained missing. They walked through neighborhoods, calling her name, distributing flyers to anyone who would take them. The community rallied, strangers united by a common purpose. But beneath the activity was a growing sense of despair. More than 24 hours had passed. The window for finding Cassie alive was closing. That night, Cassie's mother couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation she'd had with her daughter in recent weeks. Had Cassie seemed worried? Had she mentioned any concerns about Matthew? The mother searched her memory for clues, anything that might help the investigation. She thought about the custody arrangement, the tension that always surrounded the exchanges. She remembered how Cassie had confided that Matthew could be controlling, how he seemed to resent her independence. But Cassie had never indicated she felt physically threatened, or had she? The mother's mind raced, second-guessing every memory, every interaction. By morning on March 29, investigators received a tip. A resident near Milton, a small town about 30 miles from Pensacola, reported seeing unusual activity near a wooded area off a rural highway. The resident described seeing a vehicle matching the description of Matthew White's car parked near a dirt road on the night of March 27. The person hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after seeing news coverage of Cassie's disappearance, they felt compelled to call it in. Officers were dispatched immediately, their vehicles kicking up dust as they drove down narrow dirt roads. The area was remote, surrounded by thick pine forests and palmetto scrub. It was the kind of place where you could go for days without seeing another person, where the silence was broken only by birdsong and wind. The officers parked near the tree line and began searching on foot, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. The cadaver dogs moved ahead, their noses low to the earth. They had been trained to detect the scent of decomposition, a skill that made them invaluable in cases like this. The handlers followed closely, watching for any change in the dog's behavior. Minutes passed. The team moved deeper into the woods, branches catching at their uniforms. Then, one of the dogs stopped and began barking. The officers converged on the spot, their hearts sinking. The ground showed signs of recent digging, loose soil, broken vegetation, an area that had clearly been disturbed. One officer knelt down and carefully began removing layers of dirt and leaves. The others stood back, their faces grim. They all knew what they were about to find. Beneath a thin layer of earth, they uncovered what appeared to be fabric. The officer paused, took a breath, and continued carefully excavating. Within minutes, the terrible truth became clear. A body lay in the shallow grave, partially concealed, but unmistakable. The officers called for the crime scene unit, their voices tight with grief. This was no longer a missing person case. This was murder. The crime scene technicians arrived quickly, bringing equipment to document and process the scene. They erected a perimeter, took photographs, and began the painstaking work of evidence collection. Every detail mattered: soil samples, fiber evidence, any trace that might help identify the killer. The medical examiner was called to the scene to oversee the recovery of the body. It would take hours to properly document everything, but the investigators worked with careful precision. This was someone's daughter, someone's mother. She deserved their best effort. Within hours, the body was identified through dental records and personal effects. It was Cassie Lynn Carli. She had been murdered and buried in a remote location, her life stolen in an act of brutal violence. The medical examiner would later determine that she had died from blunt force trauma, likely sustained during a violent assault. The injuries suggested a struggle, a desperate fight for survival that Cassie had ultimately lost. The news hit Pensacola like a shockwave. Cassie's family collapsed under the weight of confirmation. Their worst fears had been realized. The woman they loved, the mother who had fought so hard to protect her daughter, was gone. The community grieved alongside them, their prayers shifting from hope to mourning. Vigils were organized, candles were lit, and flowers were placed at the parking lot where Cassie was last seen alive. The quiet rhythms of the city had been shattered, replaced by a collective sorrow that spread through every neighborhood and every heart. Cassie's mother received the notification from a detective who had been working the case. The officer's voice was gentle but firm, delivering words that would forever divide the mother's life into before and after. Before she knew her daughter was dead, after she received confirmation that Cassie would never walk through her door again, the mother's scream echoed through the house, a sound of pure anguish that her family would never forget. They rushed to her side, holding her as she collapsed, her body racked with sobs. The investigation shifted from a missing person case to a homicide. Detectives worked around the clock, analyzing every piece of evidence they had collected. They pulled Matthew White's phone records, tracking his movements on the night of March 27. The data was damning. Cell tower pings placed his phone near the burial site in Milton during the hours after the custody exchange. His digital footprint traced a route from Pensacola to the remote wooded area and back again. The timeline aligned perfectly with Cassie's disappearance and death. Officers also analyzed the surveillance footage more closely. They noticed Matthew's behavior after leaving the parking lot, the way his car had circled back, the way he had lingered. They cross-referenced his statements with the physical evidence and found inconsistencies at every turn. Matthew had claimed he went straight home after the exchange, but his phone data told a different story. He had lied to investigators, and that lie was now unraveling under the weight of undeniable proof. The forensic team processing the burial site found additional evidence linking Matthew to the crime. Tire tracks near the grave matched the tread pattern of his vehicle. Soil samples from his car's undercarriage contained particles consistent with the dirt at the burial site. Fibers found on Cassie's clothing matched materials from Matthew's vehicle. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. Matthew White had killed Cassie Lynn Carli, buried her body in a shallow grave, and returned to his normal life as though nothing had happened. On March 30, the Escambia County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras clicking furiously as the sheriff stepped up to the microphone. His face was grave as he confirmed what the community already feared. Cassie Lynn Carli had been found dead. Her death was being investigated as a homicide. The sheriff did not name a suspect, but he assured the public that justice would be served. The family, seated in the front row, wept openly. Their grief was raw and unfiltered, a testament to the profound loss they had suffered. The sheriff described Cassie as a devoted mother who had been looking forward to spending time with her daughter after the custody exchange. He spoke of the extensive search efforts, the hundreds of volunteers who had given their time, and the dedication of law enforcement personnel who had worked tirelessly to find her. He thanked the community for their support and asked anyone with additional information to come forward. The press conference lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact reverberated for days. The days that followed were filled with heartbreak and determination. Cassie's family attended vigils and memorials, their presence a reminder of the woman they had lost. Friends shared stories of her kindness, her laughter, her unwavering love for her daughter. The community rallied around them, offering meals, prayers, and support. But beneath the grief was a simmering anger. Someone had taken Cassie's life. Someone had buried her in a shallow grave and tried to erase her existence. The community demanded justice. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Local businesses displayed posters in their windows, calling for justice for Cassie. Residents wore ribbons in her favorite color. Social media campaigns urged law enforcement to act swiftly. The pressure was immense, but detectives remained focused on building an airtight case. They knew that rushing to arrest without sufficient evidence could jeopardize the prosecution. They needed every piece of the puzzle in place before they moved against Matthew White. Detectives continued building their case against Matthew White. They analyzed every text message, every phone call, every piece of digital communication between him and Cassie. The relationship had been fraught with tension, marked by arguments over custody and control. Friends and family described Matthew as volatile, someone whose moods could shift without warning. Cassie had confided in loved ones about her fears, her concerns about Matthew's behavior. Those confessions now took on new weight, painting a picture of a man capable of violence. One friend recalled a conversation with Cassie just weeks before her death. Cassie had mentioned feeling uneasy about the custody exchanges, worried that Matthew's anger was escalating. She had considered asking for supervised visits, but feared that demanding such arrangements would make things worse. She had been trying to keep the peace for her daughter's sake, navigating a dangerous situation with as much grace as she could muster. Now that friend carried the weight of those words, wondering if there was something more she could have done, some warning she should have issued more forcefully. Investigators also examined the burial site more thoroughly. Forensic teams collected soil samples, traced tire tracks, and documented the scene in meticulous detail. The shallow grave suggested haste, a rushed attempt to conceal the crime, but the location itself was significant. It was remote, difficult to access, and far from Pensacola. Only someone familiar with the area would have known to go there. Detectives theorized that Matthew had scouted the location beforehand, planning the murder with cold calculation. The thought that Cassie's death had been premeditated made the crime even more chilling. The medical examiner's report provided additional details about Cassie's final moments. She had sustained multiple injuries consistent with a violent assault. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated she had tried to fight back, tried to protect herself from her attacker. The knowledge that Cassie had fought for her life brought some measure of fierce pride to her family, even as it deepened their grief. She had not gone quietly. She had resisted until the very end. In early April, investigators confronted Matthew White with the evidence they had gathered. They laid out the phone records, the surveillance footage, the forensic findings. They described how his digital trail had led them directly to Cassie's grave. Matthew sat in the interrogation room, his composure beginning to crack. He had been so certain he could talk his way out, so confident in his lies. But now, faced with proof he couldn't deny, his defenses crumbled. The detectives pressed harder. They showed him photographs of the burial site, of Cassie's abandoned car, of her grieving family. They described the evidence in excruciating detail: the tire tracks that matched his vehicle, the soil samples that placed him at the scene, the cell phone data that tracked his every movement. They asked him why. Why had he done it? What had driven him to take the life of the mother of his child? Matthew's silence stretched long and heavy. Then, slowly, he began to speak. His confession came in fragments, pieces of truth tangled with excuses and justifications. He claimed they had argued. He said things had gotten out of hand. He insisted he hadn't meant for it to happen, that it was an accident, a moment of rage he couldn't control. But as he spoke, the detectives recognized the pattern of an abuser trying to minimize his actions, to shift blame away from himself. They listened without interruption, recording every word. Matthew White was admitting to killing Cassie Lynn Carli. The arrest came swiftly. Officers took Matthew White into custody, charging him with second-degree murder. The news spread through Pensacola like wildfire. Cassie's family felt a surge of relief mixed with profound sadness. They had wanted justice, but no arrest could bring her back. No conviction could undo the violence that had stolen her from their lives. Still, they clung to the hope that the legal system would hold Matthew accountable, that Cassie's voice would be heard even in death. Matthew's first court appearance drew a crowd. Reporters lined up outside the courthouse hours before the hearing. Inside, every seat was filled. Cassie's family sat in the front row, their faces showing the toll of sleepless nights and endless grief. When Matthew was led into the courtroom in handcuffs, a murmur rippled through the gallery. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he had seemed before. The judge read the charges aloud: second-degree murder, and asked Matthew how he pleaded. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf. The family felt a fresh wave of anger. Even now, even with all the evidence, Matthew refused to take full responsibility. Matthew's court appearances continued throughout the spring. Each hearing brought new developments, new pieces of evidence introduced into the public record. The prosecutors worked tirelessly, preparing a case built on digital evidence, witness testimony, and Matthew's own confession. They were determined to secure a conviction, to ensure that justice was served. They met regularly with Cassie's family, keeping them informed of progress and answering their questions. The prosecutors understood that their work represented more than just a legal proceeding. They were fighting for Cassie, for her memory, and for the message that violence against women would not be tolerated. As spring turned to summer, the trial date was set. Cassie's family prepared themselves for the ordeal ahead. They knew the trial would force them to relive the worst moments of their lives, to hear details of Cassie's final hours that would haunt them forever. But they also knew it was necessary. Cassie deserved to have her story told. She deserved to have the truth brought into the light. And so they steeled themselves, drawing strength from each other and from the community that had rallied around them. The trial itself was a somber affair. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in hallways and outside the building. Media coverage was intense, with reporters from across the state descending on Pensacola to cover the proceedings. The judge called for order as the jury was seated. 12 ordinary citizens had been tasked with deciding Matthew White's fate, with determining whether the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he had murdered Cassie Lynn Carli. The prosecution's opening statement was powerful and direct. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and described Cassie as a devoted mother whose only concern was the well-being of her daughter. He painted a picture of a woman trapped in a difficult situation, trying to navigate a custody arrangement with an unstable ex-boyfriend. He described the events of March 27, 2022, the custody exchange in the parking lot, Cassie's return to her car, and her sudden disappearance. Then he detailed the investigation that followed, the discovery of her body, and the mountain of evidence pointing to Matthew White as her killer. The prosecutor presented the surveillance footage, showing the jury the last images of Cassie alive. The courtroom fell silent as they watched her walk across the parking lot with her daughter, complete the exchange with Matthew, and wave goodbye. The footage was grainy but clear enough to see Cassie's face, her expression calm and motherly. The jury watched intently, understanding that they were witnessing the final minutes of a woman's life. Next came the phone records. The prosecution displayed charts, showing the cell tower pings from both Cassie's and Matthew's phones. The data told a clear story. Cassie's phone had stopped transmitting shortly after the custody exchange. Matthew's phone had traveled from Pensacola to Milton, remained there for approximately 2 hours, and then returned. The prosecutor explained how investigators had used this data to locate Cassie's burial site. The correlation between Matthew's phone location and the grave was undeniable. Forensic experts testified about the evidence collected from the burial site. They described the tire tracks that matched Matthew's vehicle, the soil samples that placed him at the scene, and the fibers that connected him to Cassie's clothing. Each piece of evidence was carefully explained, building layer upon layer of proof. The prosecution was constructing an airtight case, showing the jury that Matthew White had not only killed Cassie, but had also attempted to hide his crime. The medical examiner took the stand and provided testimony about Cassie's injuries. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as the examiner described the blunt force trauma that had caused her death, the defensive wounds that showed she had fought back. Cassie's mother sobbed quietly, her family members holding her steady. This was the hardest part, hearing the clinical details of how their beloved daughter had died, how she had suffered in her final moments. Then came Matthew White's confession. The prosecution played the audio recording of his interrogation, his voice filling the courtroom as he admitted to killing Cassie. The jury leaned forward, listening carefully to every word. Matthew described arguing with Cassie after the custody exchange, claimed she had provoked him, insisted it had been an accident. But even in his own words, the violence was clear. He had struck her multiple times. He had buried her body in a remote location. He had returned home and carried on with his life while search teams looked for her. The defense tried to cast doubt on the evidence, to suggest alternative explanations for the phone data and the forensic findings. Matthew's attorney argued that the confession had been coerced, that Matthew had been under duress during the interrogation. But the facts were too strong, the timeline too precise. Matthew's own words were the final nail in his defense. He had admitted to killing Cassie, and no amount of legal maneuvering could erase those words. When the prosecution rested, they delivered a closing argument that resonated through the courtroom. The lead prosecutor spoke directly to the jury, asking them to remember Cassie Lynn Carli, not as a victim, but as a person, a mother, a daughter, a friend. He described her love for her child, her dedication to providing a stable home, her attempts to navigate an impossible situation with grace and strength. He reminded the jury that Cassie had done everything right, met Matthew in a public place, during daylight hours, with witnesses nearby, and still, Matthew White had taken her life. The prosecutor described the evidence one final time, walking the jury through each piece of proof, the surveillance footage, the phone records, the forensic evidence, the confession. He asked them to hold Matthew White accountable, to deliver justice for Cassie and her family. He spoke of the daughter, who would grow up without her mother, of the family, forever fractured by violence. He concluded with a simple statement: Cassie Lynn Carli deserved justice, and it was now in the jury's hands to deliver it. The jury deliberated for hours. Cassie's family waited in a nearby room, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Every minute felt like an eternity, every sound in the hallway, a potential sign of news. They prayed, they cried, and they held each other close. Some worried that the jury might have doubts, that the defense might have succeeded in creating reasonable doubt. Others felt confident that the evidence was too strong to ignore. All of them simply wanted it to be over, wanted closure, after months of uncertainty and grief. When the bailiff finally called them back into the courtroom, their hearts pounded in unison. The judge entered, the jury filed in, and the foreperson stood. The judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson confirmed they had. The courtroom held its breath. Then the verdict was read: guilty of second-degree murder. The word echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Cassie's family erupted in tears, their relief mingling with grief. They embraced each other, their sobs audible throughout the room. Matthew White stood motionless, his face pale. He had been convicted of murdering the mother of his child. His fate was now sealed. The judge scheduled a sentencing hearing for several weeks later and dismissed the jury. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Cassie's family remained, clinging to each other and to the knowledge that justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters captured the family's statements. Cassie's mother spoke through tears, her voice shaking but determined. She thanked the detectives who had worked tirelessly to solve the case. She thanked the prosecutors who had fought for Cassie in court. She thanked the community for their unwavering support, and she spoke directly to other mothers navigating difficult custody situations, urging them to trust their instincts, to seek help when needed, and to never underestimate the danger of an angry ex-partner. The sentencing hearing came several weeks later. The courtroom was once again filled to capacity, the air thick with anticipation. The judge listened as victim impact statements were read, each one a testament to Cassie's life and the devastation her death had caused. Her mother spoke of the daughter she had lost: her kindness, her humor, her fierce love for her child. She described the hole Cassie's absence had left in their family, the birthdays and holidays that would never be the same. She looked directly at Matthew White as she spoke, wanting him to see the destruction he had caused. Cassie's sister read a statement on behalf of the family. She spoke of childhood memories, of the sister who had always looked out for her, who had been a constant source of support and encouragement. She described how Cassie had been excited about her daughter's upcoming birthday, had been planning a party with all the child's favorite things. That party would never happen. That little girl would celebrate future birthdays without her mother. The sister's voice broke as she concluded, but her message was clear. Matthew White had stolen not just Cassie's life, but countless moments, memories, and milestones that would never be. Friends testified about Cassie's impact on their lives. One spoke of how Cassie had been there during her own difficult divorce, offering support and encouragement. Another described Cassie's volunteer work at their daughter's school, how she had always been willing to help with class parties and field trips. Each statement painted a fuller picture of who Cassie had been, not just a victim, but a vibrant, caring person whose presence had enriched the lives of everyone around her. When it was time for sentencing, the judge did not hesitate. He condemned Matthew White's actions in the strongest terms, calling them cowardly, cruel, and utterly inexcusable. He spoke of the premeditation evident in Matthew's actions, the way he had lured Cassie to that parking lot, the violence he had inflicted, and the calculated attempt to hide his crime. The judge noted Matthew's lack of genuine remorse, his continued attempts to minimize his responsibility even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Then the judge delivered the sentence: life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in applause. Cassie's family sobbed, their relief palpable. Justice had been served. Matthew White would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. He would never walk free again, never have another chance to inflict pain on those around him. The gavel struck, finalizing the sentence, and officers led Matthew away. He cast one final glance back at the courtroom, but no one met his eyes. He had become a symbol of everything the community despised: violence, betrayal, and the destruction of innocence. In the days and weeks that followed, the community began to heal. Memorials were held for Cassie, her life celebrated by those who had known and loved her. Her family found solace in the support of friends and neighbors, in the knowledge that Cassie's story had been heard and her killer held accountable. They established a scholarship in her name, ensuring that her legacy would live on in the lives of young mothers seeking education and opportunity. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of love and remembrance. The scholarship fund was announced at a community gathering held in Cassie's honor. Hundreds of people attended, filling the local community center to capacity. Candles were lit, forming a sea of flickering light that illuminated the evening. Speakers shared memories of Cassie, describing her generosity, her warmth, and her dedication to her daughter. A local musician performed a song written in her memory, the melody haunting and beautiful. As the final notes faded, the crowd stood in silence, heads bowed, hearts united in grief and remembrance. Cassie's daughter, now in the care of her maternal grandmother, began the long process of adjusting to life without her mother. She was too young to fully understand what had happened, but she felt the absence acutely. Her grandmother filled the house with photographs of Cassie, telling stories of her mother's kindness and strength. The little girl listened, her eyes wide, absorbing the image of the woman who had loved her so fiercely. She would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for her, that she had been taken too soon, and that justice had been served. The grandmother created a memory book for her granddaughter, filling its pages with photographs, letters, and mementos from Cassie's life. There were pictures of Cassie as a child, beaming at birthday parties and holiday gatherings. There were photos from her high school graduation, her face glowing with pride and possibility. And there were countless images of Cassie with her daughter holding her as a newborn, celebrating her first birthday, reading bedtime stories. The grandmother knew that these tangible connections to Cassie would become increasingly precious as the years passed, as memories faded, and time moved forward. The community established a support network for families affected by domestic violence. Inspired by Cassie's story, local organizations partnered with law enforcement to create resources for people in dangerous relationships. They offered counseling services, safe housing options, and legal assistance. Educational programs were developed for schools and workplaces, teaching people to recognize warning signs and intervene safely. Cassie's death had exposed the hidden dangers that existed in their community, and residents were determined to prevent future tragedies. A local church held a special service dedicated to victims of domestic violence. The sanctuary was filled with families who had lost loved ones to intimate partner violence, their faces reflecting shared grief and understanding. The pastor spoke of the need for vigilance and compassion, of the responsibility everyone carried to protect the vulnerable. Cassie's name was spoken alongside others who had been lost, their memories honored and their stories preserved. The service concluded with a commitment ceremony where attendees pledged to support survivors and work toward ending domestic violence in their community. Months passed, the seasons changed. Pensacola slowly returned to its quiet rhythms, though the memory of Cassie Lynn Carli remained etched in the community's heart. Her case had exposed the dangers of domestic conflict, the importance of vigilance, and the power of persistence in the pursuit of justice. It had reminded everyone that behind every crime statistic was a real person, a life full of hopes and dreams and love. Cassie's life had been cut short, but her story endured. Local businesses continued displaying ribbons and posters in Cassie's memory. Her photograph remained in windows throughout Pensacola, a constant reminder of the woman they had lost and the justice they had secured. School children learned about domestic violence awareness through programs established in her name. Teachers incorporated lessons about healthy relationships and recognizing danger signs. Cassie's story became a teaching tool, her tragedy transformed into a catalyst for education and prevention. On the anniversary of her death, Cassie's family gathered at the site where she was last seen alive. They placed flowers in the parking lot, their petals bright against the gray asphalt. They stood in silence, their heads bowed, their hearts heavy with loss. But they also felt a sense of peace. Cassie's killer was behind bars. The truth had been brought to light. And though the wounds remained, healing had begun. The parking lot had been transformed into an informal memorial. Strangers left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. One note read simply, "You are not forgotten, Cassie." Another said, "Your daughter will know how much you loved her." The messages accumulated over time, creating a tapestry of compassion from a community that refused to let Cassie's memory fade. The shopping center management eventually installed a small plaque on a nearby bench, dedicating it to Cassie's memory and to all victims of domestic violence. The investigators who had worked the case attended the memorial, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of the role they had played. They had spent countless hours combing through evidence, chasing leads, and building the case that had secured Matthew White's conviction. They had done it for Cassie, for her family, and for the belief that justice mattered. As they stood among the mourners, they felt the weight of that responsibility lift slightly. They had kept their promise. They had not let Cassie's voice be silenced. One detective who had been particularly involved in the case carried Cassie's memory with him every day. He kept a photograph of her on his desk, a reminder of why he did this work. When new cases came across his desk, when he felt exhausted or discouraged, he looked at that photograph and remembered the importance of persistence. He thought about Cassie's family, about the closure they had found through his efforts. It gave him strength to continue, to fight for other victims who couldn't fight for themselves. The prosecutors, too, reflected on the case. It had been one of the most challenging and emotionally draining trials of their careers, but it had also been one of the most important. They had fought for a woman who could no longer fight for herself, ensuring that her story was told, and her killer held accountable. In the courtroom, they had represented not just the state, but the values of truth and justice that underpin the legal system. They had succeeded, and that success carried a profound sense of fulfillment. The prosecutor kept copies of the victim impact statements in a file, reading them occasionally when he needed to remember why he had chosen this profession. The words of Cassie's mother, describing her daughter's kindness, and the hole her absence had left, moved him deeply. He thought about his own family, about how privileged he was to return home safely each night. He renewed his commitment to fighting for victims like Cassie, to using his skills and position to ensure that justice prevailed. For the Pensacola community, Cassie's story became a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of standing together in the face of tragedy. They had rallied around her family, offering support and solidarity when it was needed most. They had attended vigils, shared information, and demanded justice. In doing so, they had demonstrated the power of collective compassion, the strength that comes from refusing to let a victim be forgotten. Cassie's memory lived on in their hearts, a testament to the impact one life can have on many. Community leaders organized an annual 5 Kelvins run in Cassie's memory, with proceeds benefiting domestic violence prevention programs. The first run drew over 500 participants, their shirts bearing Cassie's photograph and the words, "Justice for Cassie." Runners of all ages took to the streets of Pensacola, their footsteps echoing the community's commitment to ending violence. Cassie's family participated, crossing the finish line together, their tears mixing with sweat and determination. As the years passed, Cassie's daughter grew older. She learned about her mother, not just through stories, but through the actions of those who had loved her. She saw the scholarships established in Cassie's name, the memorials held in her honor, and the unwavering support of a community that had refused to forget. She understood that her mother had been taken from her by violence, but she also understood that justice had been served, and in that knowledge, she found a measure of peace. The grandmother continued adding to the memory book, including newspaper clippings about the trial, photographs from memorial services, and letters from people whose lives Cassie had touched. She wanted her granddaughter to understand the full scope of her mother's impact, to see how one woman's life and death had inspired change and awareness. When her granddaughter was old enough, they would read through the book together, celebrating Cassie's life while acknowledging the tragedy of her death. The little girl showed signs of her mother's strength and kindness. She was protective of younger children at school, always willing to share and help. Her grandmother saw Cassie in these moments, saw the legacy of love that couldn't be erased by violence. She nurtured these qualities, encouraging her granddaughter to be compassionate and strong, just as her mother had been. It was a way of keeping Cassie alive, of ensuring that her values and spirit continued through the next generation. The case of Cassie Lynn Carli was closed, but its lessons remained open. It was a story of loss and resilience, of heartbreak and hope. It was a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow, can prevail. It was a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of evidence, and the strength of a community united in grief and determination. Cassie's life had been tragically short, but her story endured, a beacon of truth in a world too often shadowed by violence and deception. Local universities incorporated the case into criminal justice curricula, using it to teach future law enforcement officers and attorneys about the importance of thorough investigation and evidence collection. Students studied the digital forensics that had cracked the case, learning how cell phone data and surveillance footage could provide crucial proof. They examined the interrogation techniques that had led to Matthew White's confession, discussing the balance between effective questioning and protecting suspects' rights. Cassie's case became a teaching tool, her tragedy serving a purpose beyond grief. In the quiet moments, Cassie's family still felt the ache of her absence. They saw her in the smile of her daughter, in the photographs lining the walls, in the memories that surfaced unbidden. They missed her laughter, her warmth, her unwavering love, but they also felt pride. Pride that Cassie had fought so hard for her daughter, pride that justice had been served, pride that her story had been told, and her voice had been heard. And in that pride, they found the strength to carry on. The family gathered for holidays and birthdays, always leaving a place for Cassie at the table. They shared stories about her, keeping her memory alive through words and laughter. They taught Cassie's daughter about her mother's favorite foods, her favorite songs, the things that had made her smile. These traditions became sacred rituals, ways of maintaining connection with the woman they had lost. Cassie remained part of their family, present in spirit even as they mourned her physical absence. Matthew White remained behind bars, his life defined by the crime he had committed. He would never walk free again, never have the chance to rebuild or redeem himself. His actions had sealed his fate, and the justice system had ensured that he would face the consequences. For Cassie's family, his imprisonment was a bittersweet victory. It could not bring Cassie back, but it could ensure that he would never harm another person. And in that assurance, they found a measure of comfort. Prison records showed that Matthew rarely received visitors. His family, ashamed of his actions, had largely distanced themselves. He spent his days in routine monotony, working prison jobs and avoiding other inmates. Guards noted that he kept to himself, never speaking about his crime or expressing genuine remorse. He had become a cautionary tale within the prison system, an example of how domestic violence could escalate to murder. His name would be forever associated with cowardice and brutality. The shallow grave near Milton, once a scene of horror, had been filled in and marked. It was no longer a crime scene, but a reminder of the investigation that had brought a killer to justice. Occasionally, someone would visit, leaving flowers, or a small token of remembrance. The spot had become a place of quiet reflection, a testament to the persistence of truth and the resilience of those who seek it. Cassie was not buried there. Her final resting place was elsewhere, surrounded by family and love, but the site remained a symbol of the journey from tragedy to justice. A small memorial garden was created near the site where Cassie's body had been found. Local volunteers planted flowers and installed a bench with a plaque reading, "In memory of all victims of violence. May truth bring healing." The garden became a place where families of other victims could gather, finding solace in the peaceful setting and the knowledge that they were not alone in their grief. Cassie's mother visited occasionally, sitting on the bench and feeling a connection to her daughter through the earth and flowers. As Pensacola moved forward, the story of Cassie Lynn Carli became part of its collective memory. It was told in hushed tones, shared as a cautionary tale, and remembered as a call to action. The community had learned the importance of vigilance, the need to support those in vulnerable situations, and the power of coming together in the face of tragedy. Cassie's death had left scars, but it had also sparked change. Awareness campaigns were launched, support networks were strengthened, and conversations about domestic violence became more open and urgent. Domestic violence shelters in the area reported increased funding and volunteer support following Cassie's case. Women in dangerous situations felt more empowered to seek help, knowing that the community took such threats seriously. Law enforcement received additional training in recognizing and responding to domestic violence situations. Judges became more willing to grant protective orders, understanding the potential lethality of seemingly minor conflicts. Cassie's death had created ripples of change that extended far beyond her immediate circle. For the detectives who had cracked the case, Cassie's story remained a defining moment in their careers. They had seen countless investigations, but this one had struck a particularly deep chord. It had reminded them why they did the work, why they spent long hours chasing leads and analyzing evidence. It was for people like Cassie, victims who deserved justice and families who deserved closure. And as they continued their work, they carried Cassie's memory with them, a reminder of the stakes and the importance of never giving up. One detective retired several years after the case concluded, but he spoke often about Cassie's investigation during training sessions for new officers. He emphasized the importance of following digital evidence, of being thorough and persistent. He described how the cell phone data had cracked the case, how surveillance footage had provided crucial confirmation. He urged young detectives to treat every victim with dignity and every case with determination. Cassie's story became part of his legacy, a teaching tool that would influence countless future investigations. Cassie Lynn Carli's life was a story of love, strength, and resilience. She had been a devoted mother, a caring friend, and a pillar of her community. Her death had been a tragedy, a senseless act of violence that had robbed the world of a bright light, but her legacy endured. In the justice that was served, in the community that rallied around her family, and in the daughter who carried her memory forward, Cassie's spirit lived on. She was not forgotten. She would never be forgotten. The case was solved. The killer was behind bars. Justice had been served, and though the wounds remained, healing had begun. Cassie's story was a testament to the power of truth, the importance of persistence, and the resilience of the human spirit. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light can break through. Even in the face of unimaginable loss, hope can endure, and even when a life is cut short, its impact can ripple outward, touching countless hearts and inspiring change. In the quiet rhythms of Pensacola, Cassie Lynn Carli was remembered. Her name was spoken with reverence, her story told with care. She had been a mother, a daughter, a friend. She had been loved, and she had loved fiercely in return. And though her life was tragically brief, it had mattered. It had left a mark on the world, a legacy of love and justice that would endure for generations to come. Cassie was gone, but she was not lost. She lived on in the hearts of those who had known her, in the actions of those who had fought for her, and in the quiet resilience of a community that had refused to forget. Her light continued to shine, illuminating the path toward justice, healing, and hope for all who followed.